it's such a large front, it's so well defended. They're only going to be able to break through in a couple of areas. So I think they'll be looking at that. I really think they'll be looking at Crimea, because if they can have a breakthrough in significant numbers, the fact that Crimea is very lightly defended now because the Black Sea Fleet isn't around, because the Russian aircraft don't have that sort of air superiority. Most of the aircraft have moved out of Crimea now, and don't have the ability to support it. So, I would think that they are looking, if they could just get a toehold in Crimea, then that sort of changes the whole dynamic. Putin is going to have to decide. Is he going to try and hold on to the Donbass? Is he going to try and retake Crimea, or is he going to sue for peace?
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine with Hamish De Bretton Gordon. Hamish is a former commander of the Royal Tank Regiment who served on operations during the First Gulf War, as well as in Cyprus, Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq and Afghanistan, commanding main battle tanks for around 24 years. On top of that, Hamish also commanded NATO's Rapid Reaction Chemical, Biological and Radiological Nuclear Battalion, and is a Biosecurity Fellow at Magdalen College, Cambridge. Hamish, always appreciate your time. Welcome back to Frontline.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
First of all, can you just give me your assessments of where you think we are in this conflict at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. There's an awful lot of talk from various directions about the conflict is very much bogged down and sort of stalemate. I think that would be the wrong way to look at it. We are approaching the 2-year anniversary next month, 24th of February. But let's look at where we are from the various different aspects. I mean, first of all, from the maritime piece, actually, Ukraine has done incredibly well. Ukraine now has what we call maritime superiority. Ukraine rules the Black Sea. The much vaunted Russian Black Sea Fleet has disappeared, which is strange when Ukraine didn't have a navy when this war started, but they've done incredibly well. And what that gives Ukraine is the potential of what we call freedom maneuver in the Black Sea. And I think that could be very important in the spring and in future. We then look at the next element, this what we call air superiority. And this is basically control of the air. Now, really, the Russians have ruled the air from the get-go. They've got far more fighter jets. Very importantly, lots of attack helicopters. These are helicopters that they use for tank busting, which has been absolutely crucial. And when you dominate the sky, you also dominate the ground. And what we've seen over the last 2 years, really, is each time Ukraine's had an armoured thrust, got armoured forces together to try and break through the massive Surovkin line, which stretched over 1,000 miles, 20 miles deep, of minefields in some places. They always get beaten aback because it's very slow driving a tank through a minefield. And if you're being attacked by helicopters and fighter jets, it's almost impossible. So when we look at the air, things are changing. A few weeks ago, Ukraine shot down an A-50, which is their airborne command and control aircraft. Hugely significant. Without those in the air, they can't direct their fighter jets and attack helicopters. Ukraine has also managed to write down significantly the Russian Air Force, where in fact Russian fighter jets rarely fly over Ukraine territory. Even yesterday, an Su-35 got shot down by the Ukrainian Air Force. So the balance is changing. The other element to this, of course, is that the F-16, 60 F-16s, American fighter jet, very capable, superior to anything the Russians have got, are on the horizon. I mean, they should be starting, they might even be there, some of them. So when you put that together, if they have maritime and air superiority, then the land battle, the tank battle and the soldiers then becomes that much better or much easier for the Ukrainians. Now, when we look at the armies facing each other, on the one hand, you've got the Russian army, 600,000 Russian soldiers dug in trenches along that front line. Now, that's a huge figure. However, most of those 600,000 are conscripts because the Russian regular army was exhausted and killed and injured in the first year of the war. So the majority of these conscripts are poorly trained, put into the front line, and the casualty rates are incredibly high. We know from the British military intelligence that's issued every day the view is that they don't think these soldiers can do anything but stand and fight. You then look at the Ukrainians. Now, there are a lot less of Ukrainian soldiers on the ground. However, their casualty rates are a great deal lower. We don't know exactly what they are, but they're nothing like the Russians. They are very well trained. They have been training for 2 years now. When you lay on top of that the modern Western armour, the British Challenger 2 tanks, the German Leopard tanks, and the Bradley armoured fighting vehicles, and I'm sure everybody has seen pictures last week of a Bradley armoured fighting vehicle, which is really for carrying infantry, destroying a T-90 Russian tank, Russia's latest, most sophisticated tank. You suddenly go, crikey, that is impressive. And the reason they did it is because Ukrainian soldiers in the Bradley vehicle were performing far better and more professionally than the Russians. We also know the Russians have lost, potentially 4,000 tanks. We also know the Russians are on what we call a total war footing. The whole of the Russian economy is dedicated to this war. 40% of their GDP is being spent on the war in Ukraine. They're turning out 100 new tanks or refurbished tanks every month so that they can start to backfill. When we look at the Ukrainians, they haven't lost anything like that, but they haven't really moved very far. What gives me hope, a place called Avdiivka in the Donbass, over Christmas and recently, we've seen some very significant, what we call armoured manoeuvre warfare, where the Russians have attacked and then the Ukrainians have counterattacked with Leopard 2 and Bradleys and created huge amounts of casualties against the Russians. Now, if they can replicate that elsewhere, sort of come the spring, then when we tie in the maritime superiority, tie in the air superiority, you could see that eventually they might be able to make progress. However, it's all predicated by the continued support from the West. They need ammunition. They need lots of it. At the moment, the Russians are firing 5 times the amount of artillery ammunition that the Ukrainians are, because the Ukraine is firing what it's got. There's a lot of talk around Europe at the moment about support for Ukraine. We know that President Putin went to Kaliningrad the end of last week. This is a little Russian enclave, betwixt 2 NATO states in Northern Europe. That was probably more for his home audience than elsewhere, but, that he's prepared to do it. So I think at the moment we're not at stalemate. Everything, I think, from a military perspective is looking very positive for Ukraine. But the absolutely essential thing that we in the UK, in Europe and the States needs to understand is we must keep supporting them. We must give them the ammunition. Without ammunition, they ain't going anywhere.
Just on the point about air power, Hamish, I was speaking only last week on Frontline to General Philip Breedlove, and he has been very critical for months now about the lack of air support for Ukraine, saying, look, if we just gave the Ukrainians the air support that any Western nation would expect if they themselves were fighting, then they would be in a far stronger position. Do you think that providing the air power, and I hear what you say about the F-16s hopefully coming into service any time now, do you think if we're able to provide that could be the key to Ukraine making a further breakthrough?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we in the West have incrementally supported Ukraine. It started off with some artillery, the precision artillery, the HIMARS, and also some of the precision missiles like Storm Shadow that people will know about. And then we started giving them some Western tanks that make a difference. But absolutely, the air campaign is key. Air superiority is what enables the land battle. So if we could enable them to have air superiority, then they would be able to progress. I'm absolutely sure. So I would agree with that assessment that what we should be doing is giving them all we've got. Now, we've managed to persuade European countries to give F-16s. Whether 60 is enough, who knows? But there's a lot else that goes with it. The logistics support, the ability to keep these aircraft in the air. They take a hell of a lot of maintenance. And also the command and control. The Russians have their A-50 aircraft that do the command and control, which luckily are being destroyed at a pretty impressive rate at the moment. Again, Ukraine would need the same, and NATO countries have similar type of aircraft. The UK has similar type of aircraft. So, yeah, absolutely. If we can get the Ukrainians air superiority, that would be the significant difference, I think. And I'm not sure if just 60 F-16s will do that.
What tactics do you think we'll see from the Russians over the next few months? It was interesting, General Budanov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence service, I think said only yesterday that Russia's winter-spring offensive is now underway, in particular around the Kharkiv-Luhansk Oblast border. Do you think they will have much success in terms of their advancements?
No, I don't. I think they will have local success, I expect. It's very First World War. Exactly the same thing happened. You get a bit of local success, and you create a bridgehead, and then that collapses. And my own regiment, the Royal Tank Regiment, back the Battle of Cambrai in 1917, first major use of tanks. The front line in the First World War moved, I think, 25 kilometers in one day, which was unheard of. I mean, actually, if the Ukrainians could move the front line 25 kilometers today, that would be pretty significant. But unless you can back it up and keep reinforcing success, then you don't get anywhere. And that's really what's happening to the Russians at the moment. But I think Putin and the Russians realize they just need to grind this on. We've got the elections in the UK coming up probably at the end of this year. The most significant, of course, is we've got the American election in November, with potentially Trump taking the reins in January. I think Putin thinks if he can hang on till Trump comes into power, then he'll be in a good place. Trump is sort of saying other things at the moment, but then he changes more regularly than the weather in the UK, I expect, for the way he approaches these things. So I think it's all to play for. It's how the West moves and supports. And I don't think the Russian offensive in Ukraine is going to get anywhere. There's a lot of talk, and in fact, a really good speech by the Polish foreign minister to German newspapers yesterday on this topic, perhaps suggesting that the Russians might try a feint in the very far north of their area, perhaps into Finland, and see what NATO does. If Russia makes a small incursion into Finland, in theory, that would be an Article 5 thing where everybody dives in. But will they? He also, the Polish foreign minister, pointed out that the tactical nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad, the Russian ones, brought Berlin into range. And why weren't the Germans more concerned about that? I think on the converse, the news was broken at the weekend or last Friday that the US was going to station tactical nuclear weapons in the UK, RAF Lakenheath, which to me, as a particular area of my expertise, I think that's a really good move. That sort of cancels the Russian Kaliningrad sort of threats in a way. But Putin is really trying to give NATO lots of different things to think about. So if he can get us off balance by perhaps feinting to the north, of course, he's not directly involved what's happening in the Middle East at the moment, but crikey, he's pouring as much petrol on that as he can. And let's not forget, it's the Iranian drones, Shaheeds, that he is really using to great effect, and also Iranian ammunition. So he's delighted that the US in particular and ourselves are looking sort of southeast, as it were. And it would appear that most of the Royal Navy is heading towards the Red Sea. If they're doing that, they're not keeping an eye on the Russian fleet in the Atlantic, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, lots of different things happening at the moment. And that is, Putin is hanging on, which is absolutely the converse what Ukraine must do. Ukraine has got this year to get a resolution, and with Putin hanging on, that goes to why it's so important that we provide Ukraine with the ammunition and ideally enable their air superiority so that they're very effective armoured formations on the ground can punch through this massive line of defence. And once they get through with the maritime superiority, you can see their Marines landing on the Crimea to be able to link up. So, yeah, it's. I'm sure we were saying the same things 12 months ago, but what the difference now is, we all know that the world is going to change because politics are going to change at the end of this year, and Ukraine needs to resolve things by then.
And what we're all waiting for is for the US Congress to hopefully finally approve extra military aid for Ukraine. If and when that comes, what specifically does Ukraine need? I mean, I've spoken to a lot of people who say fundamentally they just need more artillery rounds.
Yeah, I mean, the basis of the land battle is artillery. And what we've seen in this conflict is, artillery is even more important now than it's ever been. Hitherto, artillery is what we call an area weapon. Basically, it's high explosive shells that you chuck at the enemy, and you chuck enough of them in the general direction. And artillery fire, I know from a lot of personal experience, it's very frightening, it's very unnerving, and basically you keep your head down, and you hope you don't get a direct hit, and you put your head up when it's gone. But what we've seen in Ukraine is that these artillery, because of the use of drones, virtually every artillery shell that's fired, particularly from the Ukrainian side, has a drone at the other end doing what we call seeing the fall of shot and correcting it. So every round can be fired very, very accurately. But there is still a real quality and quantity. And the Russians are firing 5 times the amount of artillery shells that the Ukrainians are. Maybe not as accurately, but again, it's hugely important. The other thing about artillery is what we call the precision artillery. These are the missiles that you can land on a sixpence or a 5-pence piece, for sort of more modern vernacular, from a long way away. And that is really, really impressive. And we've seen, the UK Storm Shadow missile, which is a big missile, travels a couple of hundred miles, taking out, Russian ships. I mean, that is phenomenal. So the key thing that Ukraine needs is ammunition, mainly artillery ammunition, mainly precision-guided missiles. But also when Ukraine tries to break out, it's amazing how much tank ammunition you'll get through, and everything else. And that again is something that the scales of usage of simple ammunition like artillery ammunition, and just ammunition you put in a rifle, are the scales that people were using in the First World War. But industrial production is not what it was in the First World War. The Russians are ramping it up. We're talking about it, but we need to, because if this war is not over this year, again, as the Polish government have said, they think NATO will be at war with Russia within 3 years if it's not resolved this year, and that is a possibility that we must plan for.
I wanted to ask you, Hamish, about the reports we've had in recent weeks actually, of a disagreement between President Zelensky and General Zaluzhny, Ukraine's military commander-in-chief. Even some suggestions that President Zelensky may have tried to dismiss General Zaluzhny. What should we make of that?
This is a really, really difficult one. And, it's before social media, and I don't want to sound like some old fart, this wouldn't be an issue. Nobody would know about it. But the whole war is being played out in real time on social media. So any slight, disagreements, whatever, are blown up. Now, one must also be absolutely aware that the Russian propaganda and disinformation effort is unbelievably comprehensive and large. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if a lot of the stuff on social media is emanating from the Russians. There might be something in it, but you can just see that the Russian social media people sat in, the equivalent of GCHQ in Moscow are thinking, right, this is a juicy bit. Let's inflate it, conflate it, change it to try and get things there. I would say, I mean, it's when we look at British military commanders, something we are very bad of in this country is dismissing our generals who do not perform. Maybe because I think maybe in the Second World War perhaps we did, but since then, and I certainly wouldn't name any names, but I think there are a few of my contemporaries who perhaps didn't perform quite as well in places like Afghanistan and Iraq as you would have thought. He should have probably been kicked out, but weren't. Then you look at the Russians. The degradation of Russian generals in Moscow is almost equivalent to the degradation of Russian soldiers in the front line. I mean, one mistake almost, and the Surovkin, Prigozhin, Gerasimov. I mean, it's just a continual list. So, in warfare, you always get this sort of stuff. I would have thought the last thing that the Ukrainians would want is to change key personnel at this stage. But, we don't know what is really happening. But all I've seen of the general is he seems like he's pretty effective. But politics always come into this. But I think, we just need to see how it plays out. A lot of it will no doubt is being encouraged and fueled by Russian propaganda and disinformation. So, if the Russian trolls are worrying about that and not seeing other things that might be more important happening in the background, then, so be it. That's fine.
From what you've seen, Hamish, almost 2 years now since the full-scale invasion happened, how would you compare the effectiveness of Ukraine's command structure to Russia's?
Well, it's very different, of course. The Russian command structure is very strange. People like Shoigu and others, they might have vast amounts of medals on their chests, but actually their operational experience is very limited. I gather most of Shoigu's medals are for, walking across a long plank on a cold river sort of thing. I don't want to be too cynical about it, but these people are there not necessarily for their own talents and what they know, more who they know, and particularly somebody like Putin, who surrounds himself with people who will do what he tells them and are not going to stab him in the back. So the Russian generals who've been successful are pretty unpleasant characters. So I sort of highlight Surovkin, who I saw at close hand in Syria, and he was the designer of really the scorched earth policy, attacking hospitals, attacking schools in Syria to break the will of the civilian population to keep going, as it were. And Surovkin was brought in by Putin to do exactly the same in Ukraine. And when that didn't work, he was off to the salt mines. Again, Prigozhin, the Wagner leader, who, really led, and Prigozhin was not a soldier. I mean, he was Putin's chef of all things, but he was obviously a flipping good cook, and Putin liked him. But, his Wagner group was successful because, they were led through money and fear, whereas your average Russian soldier, just doesn't want to be there and was paid very little. So when you look at that, I'd say the Russian high command is very dysfunctional. You look at the Ukrainians, and for a number of years now, Ukraine has been sort of integrated into the NATO way of thinking. I know that we, in particular, the Brits, have been training their senior commanders for many years. I have been fortunate to meet some of the brigade and divisional commanders who I are always impressed how capable they are. They've all learnt English so that they can go to these NATO training conferences and learn from their compatriots. And of course, now they have 2 years of battle experience, hard battle experience, and now they're getting the latest and best Western kit. So, Yeah, from what I've seen of them, I think they've been very impressive. And when you look at the lower level commanders, the sort of regimental commanders and the company commanders, a lot of these people have been brought in because of the war, and they are fighting for their homeland. They're fighting for Ukraine ground. And that's very different from the Russians, who, apart from some of the senior ones, just don't want to be there. They're seeing their friends die, in massive amounts. Their fighting spirit, as we call it, is it's not non-existent, because the Russian soldiers know if they don't go forwards, they'll get shot going backwards. So, yeah, I think if it was a level playing field, Ukraine would have steamrolled through and kicked the Russians out. And that's really what we must do now: is level the playing field, give them the ammunition and everything else they need to succeed.
And just finally, Hamish, if you were in General Zaluzhny's shoes and you were planning the strategic military objectives for the next few months for Ukraine, what would you be prioritising, especially whilst we wait for the further military support that we hope comes?
Well, I'm sure what's been going on is they are looking to see where they can break through. Now, it's such a large front, it's so well defended. They're only going to be able to break through in a couple of areas. So I think they'll be looking at that. I really think they'll be looking at Crimea, because if they can have a breakthrough in significant numbers, the fact that Crimea is very lightly defended now because the Black Sea Fleet isn't around, because the Russian aircraft don't have that sort of air superiority. Most of the aircraft have moved out of Crimea now, and don't have the ability to support it. So, I would think that they are looking, if they could just get a toehold in Crimea, then that sort of changes the whole dynamic. Putin is going to have to decide. Is he going to try and hold on to the Donbass? Is he going to try and retake Crimea, or is he going to sue for peace? Now, last week there was a lot of talk, whether it had any substance to it, that the Russian Putin was actually thinking about peace. Zelensky very quickly jumped on it and said, we'll talk peace once you've got off Ukrainian lands. So I think that will be the main sort of the Schwerpunkt, as Klaus Fitch would say, the point of main effort, seeing what they can do in Ukraine. It's unlikely, I think, at this stage that they can really make huge advances in the east. But I think the spectre of losing Crimea might well focus Putin's mind that this is something that he needs to sort out. And I don't think the Russians have what we call the strategic reserve, the sort of armoured manoeuvre forces that would be able to react quickly enough for the reasons we've really discussed. But I am sure they're also thinking, if we're still here this time next year, then we ain't going any further. That's as far as we'll get, and we'll have to either sue for peace or just keep on fighting year in, year out. And I don't think they'll be able to do that, because the EU and the US and UK and others just won't be able to provide the ammunition to do it.
Hamish De Bretton Gordon, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.